The courthouse loomed like a fortress, its stone walls swallowing the morning light. Inside, whispers floated through the corridors, rippling like static as the triplets stepped in with their mother. Malik walked first, his shoulders squared as though he could shield Renee from every judging eye. Imani followed close behind, her hand wrapped around their mother's arm, silently lending her strength. Jalil trailed with a restless swagger, his eyes scanning the crowd with a sharp defiance that dared anyone to look too long. They had dressed carefully that morning, matching black suits for the boys, a modest navy dress for Imani, and a pale gray blazer for Renee. Yet no fabric could disguise the weariness etched into their mother's face. For 18 years she had carried the weight of both parents on her shoulders, and now, in this cavernous hall of justice, she looked smaller than she ever had. "Stay close," Malik murmured, glancing over his shoulder at his siblings. His voice carried the command of someone used to leading, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "I'm not going anywhere," Imani said softly, her tone a fragile thread of reassurance. "Neither am I," Jalil muttered, shoving his hands in his pockets. "But if anyone starts something, I swear—" "Not today, Jalil," Renee interrupted, her voice steady but low. She didn't need to look at him to know the fire in his eyes. They entered the courtroom. The air inside was heavier, charged with the expectation of battle. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters tapped their pens, and spectators shifted in their seats, hungry for scandal. At the front, the empty judge's bench rose like a throne, casting a shadow over the room. Renee drew a trembling breath, her fingers tightening around Imani's hand. "This isn't just about me," she whispered, barely audible. "It's about us, all of us. Remember that." The triplets nodded in unison, the unspoken vow passing between them. They had fought off neighborhood bullies together, studied through sleepless nights together, and endured whispers about their father for years. Whatever waited beyond the judge's gavel, they would face it as one. The clerk's voice rang out, crisp and commanding. "All rise." The triplets stood, hearts pounding. Malik's jaw tightened, Imani's lips parted in a silent prayer, and Jalil crossed his arms, bracing for war. And as the doors opened for the judge to enter, Renee's hand slipped for just a second. Her eyes widened in shock, an expression her children had never seen before. The courtroom doors swung open with a low groan, and silence fell like a curtain. Judge Robert Hayes stepped in, his black robe flowing behind him as though he carried the weight of the entire system on his shoulders. His presence filled the room instantly, not with noise, but with a gravity that bent everyone toward obedience. Renee's breath caught. Her fingers twitched, then froze on the edge of the table. Malik noticed, his sharp eyes flicking to her face, but she quickly masked the expression, lowering her gaze. "Be seated," the judge commanded, his voice deep and even, honed from years of authority. The audience obeyed without hesitation, the creak of benches the only sound that dared follow his words. Malik leaned closer to his mother. "What is it?" he whispered. "Nothing," she said too quickly, her tone tight as a clenched fist. But it wasn't nothing. Renee couldn't ignore the familiar cadence of that voice, the unmistakable tilt of his jaw beneath the gray stubble, the hard lines around his eyes that time hadn't erased. She had spent years trying to forget them. And here he was, presiding over the case that could destroy her. The triplets studied him with quiet intensity. Malik frowned, his protective instinct prickling. Imani tilted her head, sensing something strange in her mother's silence. Jalil, less restrained, whispered under his breath, "Man looks like he hasn't smiled in 20 years. Order in the court," Judge Hayes said, scanning the room with eyes that seemed to pierce through walls. And then, just for a flicker of a moment, those eyes lingered on the triplets. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptible, a flicker of recognition? Confusion? He cleared his throat and forced his gaze back to the docket. The opposing attorney rose, eager and confident, but the triplets barely heard his introduction. They were too focused on the tension simmering between their mother and the judge, an invisible thread pulling tight across the room. Renee's shoulders stiffened. She stared at the polished wood of the defense table, refusing to meet Hayes's gaze. but her silence said more than words could. Malik clenched his jaw. Whatever storm was brewing in that courtroom, he swore he would not let it swallow his mother whole. Long before the weight of courtrooms and whispered scandals, Renee Carter had been a dreamer. At 20, she was a law student with ambition burning bright, determined to prove that a black woman could stand tall in a world that too often tried to shrink her. She had walked into the university library one evening and met Robert Hayes, a graduate student then, charismatic, confident, with a smile that promised both danger and warmth. At first, he seemed like a miracle. He bought her coffee when she was too broke to afford her own. He stayed up with her until dawn, quizzing her on case law and teasing her when she stumbled over Latin terms. He spoke of justice as though it were a tangible thing he could bend with his will, and Renee, young, hopeful, believed in him. Their romance was swift, intoxicating, and all-consuming. Nights spent on rooftops talking about futures they would conquer. Days filled with promises. We'll change the system together. We'll fight side by side. Renee had never felt so alive, so sure that her path was intertwined with his. But promises are fragile things. The cracks began small, Robert's unexplained absences, the scent of another woman's perfume lingering on his coat, the dismissive way he brushed off her questions. Renee tried to hold on, telling herself love was worth the doubt. Yet the truth came crashing down when she discovered the depth of his betrayal. Robert was already entangled with another woman, one who came from money, power, and influence. A union that would carve the way for his career. When she confronted him, his charm hardened into cruelty. "You don't understand, Renee," he said, voice clipped. "I have to think of my future." Her hand trembled as it pressed against her belly, already carrying the beginning of the lives he would never claim. "What about our future?" Robert's silence was her answer. He turned away, walking into the night, leaving her standing alone with nothing but broken dreams and the weight of 3 heartbeats she would one day call her children. Renee chose silence after that. She never told Robert about the pregnancy, never sought him out again. Pride and pain stitched her lips shut. She worked double shifts, studied with a baby on each hip, and clawed her way through the kind of exhaustion that leaves scars. And through it all, she whispered one promise to her unborn children: you will never feel unwanted. You will never feel abandoned. In the courtroom years later, Renee sat stiffly, refusing to meet the judge's eyes. She wondered if he felt the same ghost tugging at him, the memory of a love that once burned, and the children who bore his reflection. The clerk's voice rang out again. "The defense calls Malik Carter to the stand." Malik rose, his frame tense, yet every step toward the witness box carried the fire of determination. He swore the oath with his chin high, his eyes darting briefly to Renee before fixing on the opposing attorney. "Mr. Carter," the lawyer began, his tone syrupy, "you're only 18. How could you possibly understand the hardships your mother faced?" Malik leaned forward, his voice sharp. "I don't need to understand every legal term to know sacrifice. I watched my mom work 3 jobs so we could eat. I saw her fall asleep at the kitchen table, her hands blistered, just so we'd have a chance at something better. Don't stand there and tell me I don't know hardship." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Renee's eyes glistened with pride, while Judge Hayes shifted in his seat, his gaze lingering on Malik's defiant posture, so much like his own at that age. Next came Imani. She walked with a quiet grace, smoothing her skirt before sitting down. Her voice, though soft, carried a weight that silenced the room. "My mother is the strongest person I know," she began. "She taught me that dignity doesn't come from wealth, but from the way you treat people. She never complained, never asked for pity. She gave us love when she had nothing else left to give. And if that isn't enough proof of character, then maybe you don't know what character means." Even the court stenographer paused for a moment, her fingers frozen on the keys. Judge Hayes's throat tightened. Imani's eyes mirrored his own, a reflection he could no longer ignore. Finally, Jalil swaggered to the stand. He smirked at the opposing counsel before the man even opened his mouth. "So," the lawyer said, clearly irked, "what exactly do you think qualifies your mother to win this case?" Jalil leaned back, folding his arms. Qualified? She kept 3 kids alive when everyone counted her out. She turned nothing into something, and you're asking me for qualifications? You ever try cooking dinner with $20 to last a week? Or convincing 3 teenagers to stay out of trouble when the world wants to chew them up? She's more qualified than anyone in this room to win at life, and that's all that matters. Laughter broke through the tension, even from the jury box. The lawyer's face flushed, but Jalil only grinned wider. Judge Hayes's gavel struck. "Order!" he barked, but his hands trembled on the handle. Each word from the triplets chipped at the walls he'd built around himself, leaving cracks wide enough for truth to seep through. When Renee's name was called, the triplets rose instinctively, as if ready to shield her. She gave them a gentle nod before making her way to the stand, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Every step felt like walking into the past, into shadows she had long buried. She raised her right hand, swore the oath, and sat down. For a brief moment, she closed her eyes, gathering the strength she had clung to for 18 years. When she opened them, her gaze swept the room, not at the reporters, not at the opposing attorney, but at her children, who watched her with unshakable faith. The lawyer wasted no time. "Ms. Carter, can you explain to the court why you believe you are entitled to keep sole custody and control of your assets, given your financial struggles?" Renee's lips pressed together, then she leaned toward the microphone. "Because struggle doesn't define failure. Struggle defines sacrifice. I have worked every day of my life since the moment I became a mother. I cleaned houses, I stocked shelves, I typed reports until my fingers bled. Not because I wanted recognition, but because I had 3 children depending on me." Her voice cracked, but she steadied it, drawing a deep breath. "I never took the easy way. I never leaned on anyone. And though there were nights I went without food, my children never did. That's what being a parent means, giving everything you are so your children never feel less." The opposing attorney smirked. "And what about their father? Why have you refused to reveal him all these years?" The courtroom held its breath. Renee's eyes flicked toward the bench for the briefest second before hardening. "Because he made his choice. And I made mine. I chose to protect my children from the shadow of a man who abandoned us. They don't need his name to validate their worth. They are everything despite him, not because of him." Gasps stirred through the gallery. Malik's fists clenched at his sides. Imani's eyes brimmed with tears. Jalil's jaw tightened, his smirk replaced by quiet fury. Judge Hayes gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. Every word struck like a hammer against his conscience. Renee's testimony wasn't just for the court, it was a confession meant for him. And it was breaking him apart. The courtroom was hushed after Renee stepped down, as though her words still echoed against the walls. Judge Hayes sat frozen, the gavel untouched in his hand. He tried to keep his breathing even, but every time his eyes drifted back to the triplets, something inside him cracked. Malik sat tall, shoulders squared like armor, his jawline a mirror image of Hayes's own when he was young. Imani leaned close to her mother, offering comfort, her soft, steady gaze a reflection he had once seen in the mirror of his first love. And Jalil, leaning back with a sly half-smile, eyebrows raised in challenge, embodied Hayes's own youthful arrogance, the swagger he had tried so hard to bury under years of discipline. The resemblance was undeniable, and it gnawed at him like a relentless whisper. Could it be? Hayes shifted in his chair, his robes suddenly stifling. He remembered nights long ago, Renee's laughter echoing off library walls, the warmth of her hand in his, the way she looked at him as though he could change the world. He remembered the day he walked away, choosing ambition over love, silencing the guilt that had followed him ever since. Now that guilt had faces. 3 of them. The opposing attorney droned on, calling witness after witness, but Hayes could barely hear. His focus kept pulling back to the children. Malik's fire. Imani's grace. Jalil's wit. They weren't just echoes of Renee, they were fragments of himself, living proof of choices he had buried beneath years of rulings and titles. When Jalil leaned in to whisper something to Malik, Hayes caught the sharp lift of his brow, the same gesture Hayes himself used when challenging a lawyer in court. The recognition sent a chill racing down his spine. Judge Hayes? The attorney's voice broke through his haze. Do you need a recess? The room turned to look at him. Hayes blinked, realizing his hand was trembling against the bench. His throat felt dry as sand. Yes, he said, his voice unusually strained. 10 minutes. The gavel struck, but it sounded weaker than usual, as though the authority behind it had cracked. Renee rose quickly, gathering her children. She avoided Hayes's eyes, but the stiffness of her posture betrayed the storm inside her. She had known this moment might come, the day the truth could no longer hide in silence. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Hayes remained seated, staring at the empty witness stand. The ghosts of his past had taken form, and they were no longer willing to be ignored. The recess bell echoed faintly as the courtroom emptied, leaving behind the low hum of whispers. Judge Hayes lingered at the bench, his mind unraveling. Finally, he signaled to the bailiff. Bring Ms. Carter to my chambers, he said, his voice tight. Minutes later, Renee stepped into the private room, her children waiting outside with puzzled expressions. The heavy oak door closed behind her, sealing them into silence. For a long moment neither spoke. Hayes stood by the window, his back turned, hands clasped behind him. Renee stood near the door, arms crossed as if bracing herself against the storm she had always known would come. You knew, Hayes said finally, his voice low but trembling at the edges. You knew, all these years, and you never told me. Renee's laugh was bitter sharp. Told you? You made your choice, Robert. You wanted your future, your power, your perfect little path carved by someone else's money. Where was I in that equation? Where were they? He turned then, eyes heavy with guilt. I didn't know. I swear, Renee, I didn't know about. You didn't want to know. She cut in, her voice slicing the air. I was pregnant when you left. I stood in that tiny apartment with 3 lives inside me, and you were out building your empire. Don't pretend ignorance now. Ignorance was your choice. Hayes's throat worked, but no words came. His eyes burned as he thought of Malik's fire, Imani's grace, Jalil's wit, pieces of himself walking in the world, denied by his own ambition. I thought I was doing what I had to, he whispered, the authority stripped from his tone. For my career. For stability. Renee's eyes blazed. And I did what I had to. I raised them without you. I carried the nights alone, the bills, the hunger, the tears. Don't you dare stand there and act like your absence was noble. Hayes faltered, the robe on his shoulders feeling heavier than iron. For the first time in years he looked less like a judge and more like a man caught in his own failures. They're my children, he said, the words tasting like confession. Renee's jaw clenched. No, Robert. They're my children. You forfeited that right 18 years ago. The silence that followed was crushing, filled with every unspoken regret. And outside the door, 3 sets of ears strained, hearts pounding, catching fragments of a truth that would change everything. The triplets waited in the hallway, pacing like restless lions. Malik stood closest to the chamber door, fists clenching and unclenching. Imani sat on the bench, her knee bouncing nervously, while Jalil leaned against the wall, pretending to be calm but grinding his teeth. Through the thick wood, voices rose and fell, muffled but sharp. Renee's tone was fierce, Robert Hayes's voice strained. The siblings exchanged glances, trying to piece together the fragments that slipped through. Pregnant, you left, my children! Imani froze. Her wide eyes snapped to Malik. Did you hear that? Jalil tilted his head, straining. No, no way. But the swagger in his voice cracked. Malik shoved off the wall. Say it again, he whispered, pressing closer to the door. Another wave of words filtered through. They're my children! The 3 of them went still. For a moment, the courthouse hallway was no louder than the sound of their breathing. Imani's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God! Jalil barked a laugh, harsh and hollow. This is a joke, right? Tell me this is a joke. But Malik's face said it all, stone-hard, his eyes burning. He had suspected something, ever since the strange tension in the courtroom, the way their mother wouldn't meet the judge's eyes. Now the truth was undeniable. "That man," Malik hissed, jabbing a finger toward the chamber door, "is our father." Imani shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Why didn't she tell us?" "Why, after all this time?" "Because she was protecting us," Malik snapped, though his voice wavered. "Because he walked away." "You heard her." Jalil shoved his hands into his pockets, pacing like a caged animal. "So what? We've been busting our asses defending her all morning, and the guy in the robe calling the shots is him? Do you realize how messed up this is?" Imani whispered. "I don't even know how to feel. Angry? Sad? Betrayed? Try all of the above," Jalil muttered. The chamber door creaked open. Renee emerged, her face pale but composed. She froze when she saw them, all three standing there, eyes blazing, questions spilling from their silence. "Mom," Malik said, his voice rough. "Is it true?" Renee swallowed, her throat tightening. She wanted to lie, to soften it, but her children deserved the truth. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's your father." The hallway spun into chaos, anger, grief, disbelief colliding all at once. Malik slammed his fist against the wall, Imani sobbed openly, and Jalil laughed again, sharp and bitter. And Renee stood helplessly in the middle, watching the secret she had buried for 18 years shatter the bond she had fought so hard to protect. The triplets filed back into the courtroom with their mother, their faces a storm of emotion. Malik's jaw was locked tight, Imani's eyes were still rimmed red, and Jalil wore a smirk sharp enough to cut glass. The gallery buzzed with curiosity. Something had shifted during the recess, though no one could yet name it. Judge Hayes entered last, his robe dragging like a burden. He sat, but for once, his posture wasn't regal. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the bench. The bailiff called for silence, but the air remained charged, humming with the tension of secrets pressing against the walls. The opposing attorney rose eagerly. "Your Honor, in light of the evidence presented, we ask for an immediate ruling." "Sit down," Hayes interrupted, his voice low but unshakable. The words cut through the air, silencing the attorney mid-step. The courtroom stiffened in collective surprise. Hayes looked out over the faces before him, at Renee, who refused to lift her eyes, and at the three children sitting beside her. His chest felt like it was caving in. The law demanded objectivity, but blood and conscience demanded truth. "I cannot, in good faith, continue this case," he said slowly. A gasp rippled through the room. "There is a conflict of interest," the attorney sputtered. "Conflict of, Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Hayes's gavel struck, sharp and final. "It is more than irregular. It is personal." He rose, his figure towering but visibly shaken. His gaze swept across Malik, Imani, and Jalil, pausing on each as though memorizing their faces. "These young people are my children." The courtroom erupted, gasps, shouts, reporters scribbling furiously. Renee's head bowed, her secret now laid bare for all to see. The triplets sat stunned, caught between rage and relief, shame and vindication. Malik's fists clenched under the table, Imani covered her mouth, and Jalil muttered under his breath, "Well, damn." Hayes lifted the gavel again, though his hand trembled. "This case will be reassigned. I cannot rule where my own blood is concerned." The gavel fell, the sound echoing like thunder. Order dissolved into chaos, but in the storm one truth stood immovable. The man who had abandoned them was now the man who held the gavel, exposed before the world. The courthouse steps were a battlefield of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Microphones thrust forward, questions rained down like arrows. "Judge Hayes, is it true?" "Ms. Carter, why now?" "Triplets, how do you feel about your father?" Renee tightened her grip on her children's hands, guiding them through the chaos. Malik stood on her right, his jaw set like stone. Imani pressed close on her left, shielding their mother with her presence. Jalil lingered just behind, muttering curses under his breath at every paparazzi that got too close. Inside, Judge Hayes remained at the bench long after the room had cleared. His robe weighed heavy, no longer a symbol of dignity but of hypocrisy. The truth was out. His reputation would unravel. His career would likely crumble. But none of that compared to the hollow ache of 18 lost years. Outside, the triplets gathered with their mother by the car. The silence between them was deafening. Finally, Malik broke it. "So that's it?" he asked, voice raw. 18 years of lies, and we just move on." Renee turned to him, her eyes wet. "I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect you. From him. From the pain of being unwanted." Imani stepped forward, her voice trembling but steady. "You did protect us, Mom. We had love. We had everything we needed. But now we also have the truth, and we don't know what to do with it." Jalil scoffed, kicking at the pavement. "What we do is simple. We remember who raised us. Him showing up now doesn't erase 18 years of silence. Doesn't make him a father." Renee reached out, brushing a hand through his hair the way she used to when he was small. "You're right. He can't undo what he abandoned. But maybe he can at least see what he lost." The triplets exchanged a look. The anger hadn't faded, the wounds hadn't healed, but the bond between them and their mother was unshakable. Whatever storms came, they would weather them together. From the courthouse steps, Judge Hayes emerged, stripped of his aura of authority. No cameras followed him now, all attention was on the family he had denied. He paused when he saw them by the car. His lips parted as though to speak, but words failed. Malik stepped forward, blocking his mother. "You don't get to just walk back in," he said firmly. Hayes nodded slowly, pain etched deep in his face. "I know. But I'll spend whatever time I have left trying." Renee opened the car door, ushering her children inside. As they drove away, she held their hands tightly in hers. The truth had shattered them, yes, but it had also freed them. And as the city lights blurred past, the Carter family moved forward into an uncertain future, together, stronger, and no longer bound by silence.